The ballroom at Ashworth Hall had not been lit in 2 years. Tonight, every chandelier blazed. 300 candles threw their trembling light across the vaulted ceiling, catching the gold leaf on the cornices and turning the vast room into something that resembled a jewel box, beautiful on the surface, hollow at its heart. The Harvest Ball was a tradition older than the house itself, a gesture of goodwill from the Duke to his tenants, his neighbors, and the minor gentry who depended on his favor. For 2 autumns it had been cancelled. Mourning. The household had said, "The Duke is in mourning." But mourning, like all convenient excuses, had a shelf life, and the Duke's aunt, Lady Odeley, had arrived 3 weeks ago with a trunk full of opinions and a determination to drag this house back among the living. So the candles were lit. The musicians tuned their instruments in the gallery above. The long tables groaned with roasted meats, autumn fruits, and casks of cider drawn from the estate's own orchards. The tenants arrived in their Sunday best, scrubbed and nervous. The local gentry arrived in their carriages, curious and eager. Everyone came to Ashworth Hall that night for one reason, and it was not the music or the food. They came to see him. Nell Graves stood at the edge of the room, half hidden behind a column of pale limestone, a tray of crystal glasses balanced on her hands. She was new to Ashworth Hall, barely 2 months into her position as a junior companion to the household, a role so deliberately vague it amounted to little more than a servant who was occasionally asked to read aloud or mend lace. She was slight, with dark auburn hair pinned tightly beneath a plain cap, and gray-green eyes that noticed everything and revealed nothing. She wore the uniform of her station, a dress of dull charcoal wool, and she held herself with the careful stillness of a person who had learned that invisibility was a form of survival. The room was full now, buzzing with conversation and the forced gaiety of people performing enjoyment. But beneath the noise, there was a current of anticipation, a tautness like a wire about to snap. Every pair of eyes kept drifting to the far doors, the ones that led from the private wing. He was coming. Nell felt it before she saw it. A shift in the crowd, a collective intake of breath, the way a flock of starlings will suddenly change direction as one. The great double doors opened, and every person in the ballroom took a step back. Not dramatically. Not with screams or gasps. It was subtler than that, and therefore worse. It was instinctive, unconscious, a physical recoil disguised as politeness. Bodies angled away. Conversations faltered and resumed at a higher, more brittle pitch. A space opened in the center of the room, a wide, empty circle of polished floor, as though an invisible wall had been erected around the man who now stood in the doorway. Caspian Ashworth, the 8th Duke of Thornfeld, did not flinch. He was accustomed to this. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat of impeccable cut, his bearing rigid with the kind of discipline that comes not from confidence, but from a refusal to show pain. The left side of his face told the story that everyone in 3 counties already knew. A scar, thick and raised and livid, ran from his temple to his jaw, pulling the skin taut across his cheekbone and twisting the corner of his mouth into what looked, in certain lights, like a permanent grimace. His left ear was partially gone. The scarring continued down his neck and disappeared beneath his collar. 2 years ago, the east wing of Ashworth Hall had caught fire in the middle of the night. Lady Rosalind, his younger sister, had perished. The Duke had survived, but the fire had taken his face, or the half of it that the world could see, and with it, his place among the living. The rumors had followed like smoke after flame. He had been drinking. He had been negligent. Some whispered worse, that the siblings had quarreled, that the fire was no accident. None of it was true, but truth was a poor competitor against a good story, and a scarred duke made for an excellent villain. He stepped into the ballroom alone, or nearly alone. Clinging to his right hand, almost hidden by the fall of his coat, was a small figure. A girl of 7, with pale hair and enormous dark eyes that seemed too large for her thin face. She wore a white dress that made her look like a ghost. She pressed herself against his leg, her free hand gripping the fabric of his trousers, her gaze fixed on the floor. This was Maren, Lady Rosalind's daughter, the Duke's niece and ward. She had not spoken a single word since the night of the fire. The musicians, taking their cue from the awful silence, struck up a waltz. It was too loud, too cheerful, a bandage slapped over a wound. A few couples began to dance, their movements stiff and self-conscious. The rest of the room busied itself with food and drink carefully, pointedly, not looking at the man who stood alone in the center of his own celebration with the silent child at his side. Nell watched from behind her column. She watched the way the nearest guests turned their shoulders, the way the local squire suddenly found his cider glass fascinating, the way a cluster of women near the windows whispered behind their fans. She watched the Duke's face, the unscarred side, the side that was sharp and handsome and betrayed nothing. And she watched the child. Maren was trembling. Her small body vibrated with a terror so acute it was almost audible. She was staring at the crowd, at the noise, at the swirl of movement, and she was shrinking, folding inward, trying to disappear into her uncle's shadow. Her lips were pressed into a thin white line. Her knuckles, where they gripped the Duke's hand, were bloodless. Something shifted in Nell's chest. It was not pity. Or not only pity, it was recognition. She knew the trembling. She knew what it felt like to stand in a room full of people and be utterly, catastrophically alone. She set the tray of glasses on the nearest table. She did not think about what she was doing. She did not calculate the risk or weigh the consequences. She simply moved. She walked across the empty floor, the space that no one would enter, the invisible perimeter of revulsion and gossip and fear. She crossed it. Her shoes made a soft, steady sound on the polished wood. She was aware of the eyes on her, the sudden sharpening of attention from every corner of the room, but she did not look at any of them. She looked only at the child. She stopped 3 paces from the Duke. She did not look up at him. She did not curtsy or speak to him or acknowledge his presence beyond a brief, respectful inclination of her head. Instead, she knelt. She lowered herself to the floor, her gray dress pooling around her, until her eyes were level with Maren's. The child stared at her. Those enormous dark eyes, glossy with unshed tears, fixed on Nell's face with an intensity that was almost painful. Nell smiled. It was a small, quiet smile, nothing more than a softening of her expression, an offering of warmth in a room that had offered none. "The musicians are quite terrible, are they not?" she said, her voice pitched low, meant only for the child. "The violinist keeps missing the same note. Listen, there. Did you hear it?" Maren did not respond. She did not move, but the trembling slowed, just slightly, like a leaf settling after a gust of wind. "I think," Nell continued, her tone conspiratorial, as though sharing a great secret, "that the cellist is trying not to laugh at him. You can see it in his shoulders. He is shaking. There, look." The child's gaze, still enormous, still frightened, shifted. Just barely. Just enough. She glanced, for the briefest moment, in the direction Nell had indicated. "There!" Nell whispered. "You see, even the musicians know this is all rather ridiculous." The corner of Maren's mouth twitched. It was not a smile. It was the ghost of a possibility of a smile, a tremor in the architecture of her grief. But it was something. It was the first crack in 2 years of silence. Above them, the Duke looked down at the kneeling woman. She had not asked his permission. She had not addressed him. She had simply knelt on his ballroom floor and spoken to his niece as though the child were the most important person in the room. He felt something he could not name, a jolt, a fracture in the cold, numb surface of his existence. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. A hand closed around Nell's arm. The grip was hard, the fingers digging into the flesh above her elbow. "What do you think you are doing, Mrs. Varnum?" the head housekeeper of Ashworth Hall. She was a tall woman, angular and precise, with iron-gray hair pulled so tightly from her face it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. Her eyes were small and sharp and the color of wet slate. She had run this household for 18 years, first for the old Duke, and now for his nephew, and she ruled it with an authority that brooked no challenge. Nell rose to her feet, the housekeeper's grip still on her arm. "I was speaking to the child, Mrs. Varnum. You were making a spectacle of yourself," the housekeeper hissed, her voice low and venomous, "in front of the entire county. Get back to your station, now." Nell glanced down at Marin. The child's eyes had gone wide again, the brief flicker of connection extinguished, the trembling had returned. Nell felt the loss of it like a physical blow. She inclined her head. "Yes, Mrs. Varnum." She was marched back to the servants' alcove, the housekeeper's fingers leaving red marks on her arm. Behind her, she heard the rustle of the crowd closing ranks, the whispers rising like a tide. She did not look back. But someone else did. Caspian Ashworth stood where she had left him, his scarred face turned towards the alcove where the housekeeper had taken the girl. His niece was still gripping his hand, but something had changed. Marin was not trembling anymore. She was staring after Nell with an expression the Duke had not seen on her face in 2 years. It was want. The notice appeared the following morning. It was not pinned to a board. It was read aloud by Mrs. Muir Varnum herself in the servants' hall at breakfast, with every member of the household staff present. Her voice was clipped and absolute. "By order of the household, the junior companion, Nell Graves, is henceforth restricted to duties in the lower floors and service areas only. She is not to enter the family wing, the nursery, or any room occupied by His Grace or his ward without explicit instruction from myself. Any breach will result in immediate termination of her position." The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into a well. Nell sat at the far end of the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of weak tea, her face composed. She felt the other servants' eyes on her, the mix of curiosity and quiet satisfaction that always accompanied someone else's humiliation. She did not look up, she did not react. She understood perfectly what was happening. She had crossed an invisible line, and Mrs. Varnum was redrawing it in ink so dark it could not be missed. The restriction was not about propriety. It was about control. The housekeeper had seen the child's face, had seen the Duke's stillness, and had recognized a threat she could not name but felt instinctively. Nell finished her tea, rose, and went to scrub the cellars as instructed. She had learned, in the 2 most brutal years of her life, that obedience was a weapon, and patience was its edge, because her name was not Nell Graves. Her name was Seraphine Calloway, and she had come to Ashworth Hall to reclaim a life that had been stolen from her. Her father, Percival Calloway, had been one of the most respected naturalists and botanical illustrators in England. His watercolors of rare plant specimens were considered works of art as much as science, collected by universities, by the Royal Society, and by private patrons of extraordinary wealth. He had spent the final decade of his life on his masterwork, a comprehensive illustrated catalogue of the rare and exotic species housed in the famous conservatory at Ashworth Hall, commissioned by the old Duke himself. It was a project of enormous scope, hundreds of paintings, thousands of pages of notes, cross-referenced with specimens from Kew and the botanical gardens of Edinburgh and Paris. It was, by any measure, priceless. Percival had died 3 years ago, suddenly, of a fever that took him in less than a week. He had left behind his daughter, his work, and a modest but meaningful estate, a coastal cottage in Cornwall called Briar Hollow, along with a collection of original illustrations and manuscripts that were worth a considerable fortune. He had also left behind a will. The true will, drafted by his solicitor and witnessed by 2 colleagues, left everything to Seraphine. But within a month of his death, a second will had appeared, one that left the cottage, the collection, and all remaining assets to a man named Horace Varnum, a distant relation of Seraphine's late mother. Horace had moved quickly. The cottage was sold, the collection was dispersed, some pieces auctioned, others vanishing into private hands. Seraphine's protests were dismissed. The solicitor who had drafted the original will had died the previous year, and his replacement was sympathetic to Horace's position. The witnesses to the true will could not be found. Within 6 months, Seraphine Calloway had gone from a gentleman's daughter with a comfortable future to a woman with nothing, no home, no income, no name that anyone would recognize or respect. And Mrs. Varnum, the rigid, unassailable housekeeper of Ashworth Hall, was Horace Varnum's sister. The connection had been the thread that pulled Seraphine here. An old friend of her father's, a retired professor of botany named Dr. Hadley, had written to her after a year of fruitless searching. He remembered Percival speaking of his work at Ashworth Hall with a particular urgency in the months before his death. He believed, and Seraphine's own memory of her father's oblique hints confirmed it, that Percival had hidden the original will and the deed to Briar Hollow somewhere within the estate, not in the library where anyone might stumble upon them, but in the conservatory itself, among the botanical folios and specimen records that only a trained eye would know how to navigate. It was her father's final safeguard, a hiding place so specific, so deeply embedded in his own expertise that only his daughter, the girl he had raised among pressed flowers and Latin nomenclature, would know where to look. So Seraphine had disappeared, and Nell Graves, a quiet, unremarkable young woman with forged references and a talent for being overlooked, had taken her place. She had endured 2 months of scrubbing, polishing, mending, and silence, learning the architecture of the great house, the schedules of its inhabitants, the patterns of Mrs. Varnum's surveillance. She had identified her target, the conservatory that adjoined the east wing, a vast glass structure that had once been the pride of the estate but now stood locked and neglected since the fire had damaged its eastern wall. The old Duke's botanical collection was still inside, untouched, gathering dust, and the key to that conservatory hung on a ring at Mrs. Varnum's waist. The restriction that now barred Nell from the upper floors was not merely an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe. The conservatory was accessed through the family wing. Without reason to be in that part of the house, she had no opportunity to study the locks, no chance to observe when the rooms were empty, no cover for her movements. Mrs. Varnum had, with a single pronouncement, sealed off the only path to her father's legacy. But it was the child who complicated everything. Marin found her 3 days after the ball. Nell was on her knees in the scullery, her arms plunged to the elbows in gray water, scrubbing a blackened pot that seemed to resist all effort. She heard nothing, no footstep, no rustle of fabric. She simply looked up, some instinct drawing her gaze to the doorway, and the child was there. Marin stood on the threshold of the scullery, her small frame silhouetted against the dim corridor beyond. She was in her white nightdress, though it was the middle of the afternoon, and her pale hair hung loose around her shoulders. She was barefoot. She held a single object in her hands, a small, battered rag doll with one button eye. She stared at Nell with those vast, dark, unblinking eyes. Nell's hands stilled in the water. "You should not be here, little one," she said softly. "The kitchens are no place for you." Marin did not move. She did not speak. She simply stood and watched, with the patience of a creature that had nothing left to lose. Behind Nell, the cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Hargreaves, let out a sharp breath. "Lord above, the child is loose again." Someone fetched the nursemaid. "Go on. Shoo her back upstairs before Mrs. Varnum sees." A kitchen maid moved towards Marin, hands outstretched. The child flinched, pressing her back against the doorframe, her grip tightening on the doll. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. The expression on her face was one of mute, desperate appeal. "Wait," Nell said. She wiped her hands on her apron and rose slowly. She did not approach the child. She stayed where she was, several feet away, and simply looked at her. "You came to find me," she said. Not a question. Marin's chin dipped, the smallest of nods. Something in Nell's chest cracked open. She recognized that gesture, the tentative, terrified reaching out of a soul that had been alone too long. She had made the same gesture herself once, in a cold solicitor's office, extending her hand towards a truth that no one wanted to give her. "I am here," she said, "but you must go back upstairs now. Can you do that?" The child looked at her for a long, waited moment. Then she turned and padded silently away, her bare feet making no sound on the stone floor, the rag doll trailing from her hand. It happened again the next day. And the day after that. Marin appeared wherever Nell was working, silent as a moth, watchful as an owl. She never spoke. She never touched. She simply came and sat, or stood or leaned against a wall, and existed in the same space as Nell, as though proximity alone were a form of language. The staff noticed. Of course they noticed. The Duke's mute niece, the child who screamed when strangers approached her, who would not let the nursemaid hold her hand, who ate alone and slept alone and existed in a cocoon of impenetrable silence, had chosen a junior companion with no connections and no standing as her sole point of attachment. Mrs. Varnum was incandescent. "You are encouraging this," she said, cornering Nell in the linen closet on the fourth day, her voice ablade. "I do not know how, and I do not know why, but you are luring that child to you. It is manipulation, and it will stop." "I have done nothing, Mrs. Varnum," Nell replied, her voice steady. "She comes of her own accord. I have not left my assigned areas. I have not gone to her. She finds me." "Then you will make yourself less findable," the housekeeper snapped. "From tomorrow, you will work in the north cellar. You will sort and catalog the household linens that have been stored since the old Duke's time. You will begin at 6 in the morning, and you will not surface until your work is done. Is that clear?" "Yes, Mrs. Varnum." The north cellar was the coldest, darkest, most remote part of the house. It was a punishment dressed as a task. Nell understood the strategy. Mrs. Varnum was burying her alive, putting her so far from the family wing, from the conservatory, from the child, that she might as well not exist. She descended the stone steps the next morning in darkness, carrying a single oil lamp. The cellar smelled of damp and old wool, and the faint, sweet decay of things forgotten. Trunks and crates were stacked to the ceiling. It would take weeks to sort through them. She set her lamp on a crate and began. 4 hours into her work, she heard it, a soft, shuffling sound on the stairs. She turned, holding her lamp high, and there was Marin, descending the steps one at a time, her rag doll clutched to her chest, her bare feet careful on the cold stone. The child had found her. 3 floors down, through corridors and stairwells that would confuse an adult, the 7-year-old had navigated the labyrinth of Ashworth Hall and found her in the dark. Nell set the lamp down. She did not speak. She simply sat on the stone floor and waited. Marin crossed the cellar with her peculiar ghost-like silence. She sat down beside Nell, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. She placed her rag doll on Nell's knee. Then she leaned her head against Nell's arm and closed her eyes. It was the first time the child had voluntarily touched another person since the fire. Nell sat absolutely still. She could feel the warmth of the small body, the fragile weight of trust. Tears she could not afford burned behind her eyes. She blinked them away. She placed one hand very gently on the child's pale hair. "I know," she whispered. "I know." Above them, 3 floors up, in the long corridor outside his study, the Duke of Thornfeld stood listening to a report from the nursemaid, a frantic, red-faced woman who had lost the child again. "She is somewhere in the house, Your Grace, I am certain of it. She does this now. She slips away. I turn my back for a moment and she is gone. It is always the same. She goes looking for that girl, the new one. Nell." The Duke's face, what could be read of it beneath the ruin of his scar, was expressionless. "Find her," he said. "Bring her back." The nursemaid hurried away. The Duke remained in the corridor, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on nothing. He was thinking of the ballroom, of a young woman in a gray dress walking across an empty floor while 200 people watched, of his niece's face, the tremor at the corner of her mouth, the first sign of life in 2 years of silence. He was thinking of Mrs. Varnum's decree, the restriction that had banished the girl to the lower floors. He had approved it without much thought, as he approved most of the housekeeper's decisions. Domestic matters were her province. He had no interest in the management of servants. But Marin's feet, bare and purposeful, tracking through the corridors of his house in search of a girl she had spoken to for less than a minute, suggested that something was happening that fell outside the category of domestic management. The child had chosen, for the first time since the night the fire had taken her mother and her voice. Marin had reached toward someone, and his housekeeper had responded by burying that someone in a cellar. He thought of the physicians he had brought in during those first terrible months after the fire. 3 of them the finest in the north, each with their own theory about why the child would not speak. Trauma, shock, a wound to the spirit that only time could heal. They had prescribed fresh air, bland food, gentle routine, patience. They had patted his hand and taken their fees and left him alone with a girl who stared at the walls and would not eat unless he sat beside her. Not one of them had achieved what this woman, this nobody, had done in less than 2 minutes at a ball. Marin had stopped trembling. Marin had almost smiled. And now Marin was walking through the bowels of his house in her nightdress to sit beside the girl in the dark. A thought, cold and unwelcome, lodged itself in the Duke's mind. Was the restriction truly about propriety, or was it about something else entirely? He pushed the thought aside. He had work to do. The estate's accounts needed his attention. The tenants' winter rents were due. A wall on the south pasture had collapsed. He was the Duke. He had responsibilities. He did not have time to concern himself with the strange behavior of a child and a junior companion. But that night, alone in his study, the fire burning low, he found himself standing at the window that overlooked the darkened grounds. Somewhere in this house, a child who had not spoken in 2 years had placed a rag doll on a stranger's knee and leaned against her arm. And somewhere in the cellars below, a young woman with gray-green eyes and a voice that could calm a terrified child was sorting linens in the dark, obeying a rule that everyone, including himself, knew was designed to punish her for a single act of kindness. He turned from the window and sat at his desk. The numbers in his ledger blurred. The wall on the south pasture could wait. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. It was the conservatory that called to her. Even from the cellars, even through stone and plaster and 3 floors of cold silence, Seraphine could feel it, the pull of unfinished business, of a promise her father had made and a secret he had buried. She knew it was there, just beyond her reach, locked behind a door to which Mrs. Varnum held the only key. She had studied the house obsessively in her 2 months here. She knew the conservatory adjoined the east wing, accessible through a pair of glass-paneled doors at the end of the long gallery. She knew the fire had damaged its eastern wall, but left the main structure intact. She knew it had been sealed since Lady Rosalind's death, not because of the damage, which was largely cosmetic, but because the old Duke's botanical collection was inside, and no one, least of all the current Duke, wanted to deal with the memories it held. Her father had spent 3 years working in that conservatory. 3 years of painstaking illustration, of cataloging every specimen, every cutting, every dried flower pressed between sheets of tissue paper. He had known the space the way a musician knows an instrument, every shelf, every drawer, every hidden compartment built into the old cataloging system by the estate's original architect. If he had hidden documents anywhere in Ashworth Hall, it would be there, among the folios and specimen cases that only a trained botanist would think to examine. The nights grew longer as autumn deepened. The house settled into its winter rhythms, early darkness, fires banked high, the staff retreating to the warmth of the servants' hall by 9. Seraphine waited. She counted the hours between Mrs. Japrall, Varnum's final round, and the first stirring of the kitchen maids at dawn. She mapped the creaking floorboards, the doors that stuck, the corridors that carried sound, and the ones that swallowed it. She was methodical. She was patient. She was terrified. On the 12th night after her banishment to the cellars, she made her move. She waited until the house was utterly silent. The clock in the great hall had struck 1. She rose from her narrow bed, already dressed in her darkest clothes, a woolen shawl pulled over her hair. She carried no candle. She had walked these corridors enough times in daylight to know them by feel, by the texture of the walls beneath her fingers, by the change in the air as she passed from one wing to another. She descended the servants' staircase, crossed the kitchen passage, and slipped through the baize door that separated the staff quarters from the family's world. The great hall was a cathedral of moonlight, silver and black, the portraits on the walls reduced to pale, watchful faces. She moved through it like a breath, her stockinged feet silent on the stone. The long gallery stretched before her, a tunnel of darkness punctuated by tall windows through which the October moon cast long slanted rectangles of light. At the far end, the glass doors of the conservatory glimmered. They were locked. She had expected this, but she had also spent 3 evenings in the cellars examining the locks on every door she could reach, learning the mechanism, and she had found, tucked in a forgotten drawer of the old butler's pantry, a set of household keys from the previous century. One of them, a slim iron skeleton key, had opened every interior lock she had tried it on. The conservatory lock was newer, but of the same basic design. Her hands shook as she inserted the key. The metal scraped against metal, impossibly loud in the silence. She held her breath. The lock turned. The conservatory opened before her like a tomb. The air inside was cold and thick, carrying the ghost scent of earth and vegetation and the sharper note of decay. Moonlight flooded through the glass ceiling, illuminating a scene of beautiful desolation. The plants were dead or dying, their leaves brown and curled, their stems bowed like mourners at a grave. The iron framework of the great glass house arched overhead, and through its panels she could see the stars. But it was not the plants she had come for. It was the shelves. Along the northern wall, untouched by the fire damage, stood a bank of mahogany cases, floor to ceiling. These were the specimen cases, built to house the old Duke's botanical collection, the pressed flowers, the illustrated folios, the cataloging records that her father had spent years organizing. Each drawer was labeled with a small brass plate, the labels written in a hand she knew as well as her own, her father's handwriting. The sight of it nearly broke her. Those precise, elegant letters, the same ones that had written her name on birthday cards, that had labeled the plants in their garden at Briar Hollow, that had annotated the margins of her childhood books with little drawings of beetles and butterflies. For a moment she could not move. She pressed her palm flat against one of the brass plates and closed her eyes. Then she began to search. Her father had told her years ago about a technique he used for protecting important documents. He would conceal them within the cataloging system itself, filed under a specimen name that was a private cipher known only to the two of them. The cipher was simple, beautiful in its specificity. He used the Latin name of the first flower he had ever taught her to identify, the one that grew wild along the cliffs near their cottage. Centaurea cyanus, the cornflower. She worked through the drawers, her fingers moving quickly, reading the labels by moonlight. The system was alphabetical by genus. She found the C section, pulled open the drawer labeled Centaurea, and rifled through the pressed specimens inside. Cornflower, cornflower, cornflower. Sheets of tissue paper, dried blooms flattened between them. Their blue faded to a ghostly lavender. And behind the last sheet, at the very back of the drawer, she felt it. Not paper. Something thicker, stiffer. A leather portfolio, slim and smooth, wedged behind the false back panel of the drawer. Her breath stopped. Her fingers closed around it. She pulled. A voice spoke from the darkness behind her. "I would ask you not to remove that until you have explained what it is." The voice was low, quiet, and entirely without warmth. It came from the direction of the glass doors through which she had entered. Seraphine's blood turned to ice in her veins. Her hand froze on the portfolio. She did not turn around. I said, "Turn around." Slowly, her body rigid with terror, she obeyed. She released the portfolio, leaving it half-drawn from the drawer, and turned to face the voice. The Duke of Thornfeld stood in the entrance of the conservatory. He was in shirt-sleeves, his collar open, his dark hair disordered, as though he had risen from bed or, more likely, from the chair in his study where he often sat through the small hours. His scarred face was half in moonlight, half in shadow, the ruined side a landscape of silver and dark, the other side sharp, severe, and absolutely still. He was watching her with an expression she could not read. Not anger, not yet. Something colder and more patient, assessment. "Your name is Nell Graves," he said. "It was not a question. You are a junior companion in my household. You have been here for 2 months. You were restricted from the family wing 12 days ago, and you are standing in my locked conservatory at 1 o'clock in the morning, with your hand in my specimen collection." He paused. "Explain." Seraphine's mind raced. She could not tell him the truth. The truth would mean revealing Mrs. Varnum's brother, and the housekeeper would have her thrown out or worse, arrested, before she could secure the proof she needed. But a lie, any lie, would have to be extraordinary to explain what he had just witnessed. "I came to see the plants," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "The plants," he repeated. The word fell like a stone. "They are dying." A silence. Long and terrible. She could hear the glass panels of the conservatory creaking in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, the hammering of her own heart. "You broke into a locked room in the middle of the night," the Duke said slowly, "because you were concerned about the welfare of dead plants." "Not dead," she said, and the words came before she could stop them, rising from a place deeper than fear, from the part of her that was still Percival Calloway's daughter. "The Camellia japonica by the east window is dormant, not dead. The root system is intact. The Daphneodora near the door still has green at the base of the stems, and the Helleborus orientalis in the corner bed has new growth coming through. You can see it if you look. 3 shoots, pale green, just below the dead foliage. This collection is not lost. It has been neglected. It can be brought back." The silence that followed was of a different quality. It was not the silence of suspicion. It was the silence of a man who had just heard something impossible. The Duke took a step forward, then another. He moved through the conservatory until he was standing beside the corner bed. She had indicated. He looked down. In the moonlight, barely visible beneath the brown tangle of dead leaves, 3 pale green shoots pushed upward through the dark earth. He stared at them for a long time. "How do you know the Latin names of these specimens?" he asked. His voice had changed. The cold authority was still there, but beneath it was something raw, a crack in the granite. "My father taught me. Your father. He was a gardener," she said. The lie tasted like ash. "A very good one." The Duke turned to face her. He was close now, close enough that she could see the full extent of his scar in the moonlight. The puckered skin, the way it pulled at the corner of his eye, the place where his ear should have been whole. She did not look away. She had seen worse things than scars. She had seen the face of a man who had stolen her life and smiled while doing it. "A gardener," the Duke said, "whose daughter knows the genus and species of every plant in a private collection she has never been inside. Whose daughter can diagnose root health from a distance. Whose daughter handles specimen drawers with the precision of a trained archivist." He was watching her face with an intensity that felt like a searchlight. "You are not what you appear to be." I am a member of your household, Your Grace, she said, her eyes dropping to the floor. Nothing more. Look at me. She raised her eyes. His gaze held hers. The unscarred side of his face was illuminated by the moon, and for the first time she saw something she had not expected in his expression. Not anger, not suspicion. Pain. A bone-deep, familiar, exhausting pain, the same one she saw in her own mirror every morning. You will go back to your room, he said, his voice strained, as though the words cost him something. I will consider what to do. And the plants, she asked, because she could not help herself. Something shifted in his face. The ghost of an expression that might, in another life, have been the beginning of a smile. The plants will keep until morning. Go. She went. She moved past him, through the glass doors, down the long gallery, through the baize door, up the servant's stair. She did not breathe properly until she was back in her room with the door closed and her back pressed against it. Her legs gave way. She slid to the floor, her hands covering her face. She had not found the portfolio. She had been so close, her fingers on the leather, and she had been forced to leave it behind. Everything she had worked for, everything she had endured, was still locked in that drawer. But she was not dismissed. She was not arrested. The Duke had told her to go back to her room, not to pack her things. He had looked at the green shoots pushing through the dead earth, and something in his face had changed. It was not safety. It was not hope. But it was not the end. The Duke did not sleep that night. He returned to his study and sat in the dark, turning the encounter over in his mind. A junior companion who knew botanical Latin, who could identify plant species by sight in the dark, who handled specimen drawers as though she had been trained in a museum, who had broken into a locked conservatory not to steal, but to see the plants. None of it made sense within the framework of the world as he understood it. Servants did not speak Latin. Companions did not have the hands of archivists, and no one in his experience broke rules out of pure concern for neglected vegetation. Unless she was not a servant, unless she was not who she claimed to be. He thought of Marin, the child's relentless, silent pursuit of this woman. Marin had always been perceptive, even before the fire. As a toddler, she had been drawn to certain people and repelled by others with an instinct that bordered on the uncanny. Rosalind used to laugh about it. She knows the good ones, Rosalind had said. She can smell sincerity. The memory was a blade in his chest. He reached for paper and ink. He wrote a letter to a man in London, a discreet investigator he had used once before for a matter involving a tenant's disputed claim. He described the young woman as precisely as he could, her approximate age, her coloring, her manner, her knowledge. He asked the man to search for any record of a gentlewoman matching this description, likely fallen on hard times, possibly connected to the field of botany or natural history. He sealed the letter and set it aside. Then he sat back in his chair and thought about the conservatory. He had not been inside it since the night of the fire. It was the place where Rosalind had spent her happiest hours, tending the plants their grandfather had collected, filling the glass house with warmth and color and the sound of her voice singing to the cuttings as she watered them. After her death, he had locked the door and told himself it was because of the fire damage. But the fire damage was on the east wall. The rest of the conservatory was untouched. He had locked it because he could not bear to see it without her. And now a stranger had told him that the plants were still alive, that new shoots were pushing through the dead earth, that what he had assumed was destroyed had merely been waiting. He did not know what to do with that information. It felt too large, too dangerous, too close to a metaphor he was not ready to accept. Mrs. Varnum arrived at his study door at 8 the next morning, her face a mask of righteous fury. She had discovered the conservatory door unlocked during her dawn rounds. Your Grace, the conservatory has been breached. The lock shows signs of tampering. I believe the girl Nell Graves is responsible. This is the second time she has been found where she has no business being. First the ballroom, now a locked room in the family wing. She is either a thief or something worse, I insist." She be dismissed immediately, and the constable informed. The Duke listened from behind his desk, his fingers steepled. He let her finish. Then he spoke, and his voice was the voice of a man who had spent the night making a decision. "I was in the conservatory last night, Mrs. Varnum." The housekeeper's mouth opened, then closed. "I could not sleep. I decided to inspect the fire damage. It has been 2 years, and the repairs can no longer be deferred. While I was there, I noticed the girl passing in the corridor and instructed her to bring me a lamp. She did so, and then returned to her quarters. If the lock appears tampered with, it is because I forced it myself. The key you carry appears to be corroded. You will have a new one made." The lie was smooth and absolute. He delivered it without a flicker of hesitation, and he watched the housekeeper's face as it landed. He saw the flash of understanding in her small, sharp eyes, the realization that her version of events was being overwritten by his. He saw the fury beneath her composure, the impotent rage of a woman who was being contradicted by the one person she could not challenge. "Your Grace," she said, her voice tight, "I feel it is my duty to express my concern about this young woman. Her behavior is irregular. Her influence over the child is unnatural. I believe she poses a risk to the good order of this household." "Your concern is noted," the Duke said. "The matter is closed. The girl will continue in her position. You will assign her to the regular household rotation. And Mrs. Varnum," he added, as she turned to leave, "the restriction you imposed regarding the family wing is rescinded. The girl is to have the same access as any other member of staff." The housekeeper's back went rigid. For a moment, Seraphine's entire future hung on the thin edge of the older woman's composure. Then Mrs. Varnum gave a stiff nod and left the room without another word. The Duke sat back in his chair and let out a breath he had not known he was holding. He had just lied to a woman who had served his family for nearly 2 decades. He had done it deliberately and without remorse. He did not yet understand why the girl in the conservatory had compelled this betrayal of trust, but he knew with a certainty that sat in his bones like iron, that Mrs. Varnum's version of events was wrong. The girl was not a thief. She was not a danger, she was something else entirely, and until he understood what, he would shield her. The shift in the household was seismic. By midday, every servant at Ashworth Hall knew that the Duke had personally overruled Mrs. Fernham, that the girl, Nell, had been restored to the general rotation, that the restriction had been lifted. The whispers were electric. In 18 years, the Duke, neither this one nor the one before him, had never countermanded the housekeeper. Mrs. Varnum's authority had been the one constant of Ashworth Hall, as immutable as the stone walls. Now a crack had appeared, and the entire household felt the tremor. Seraphine moved through the changed landscape with extreme care. She was no longer invisible. She was an object of intense curiosity, speculation, and in some quarters, hostility. The other servants regarded her with a wary mixture of fascination and resentment. Mrs. Varnum did not speak to her at all, issuing instructions through a junior housemaid, her face a frozen mask whenever their paths crossed. But the worst of the punishment had stopped. She was no longer in the cellars. She was assigned to the morning room, the library, the corridors of the family wing. She was close again, close to the conservatory, close to the drawer labeled Centauria, close to the portfolio her fingers had touched before the Duke's voice had stopped her cold, and Marin was back. The child appeared in the morning room on the first day of Seraphine's restored duties, slipping through the door like a small, silent ghost. She carried her rag doll in one hand and a picture book in the other. She crossed the room, sat on the floor beside Seraphine's feet, opened the book, and began to turn the pages with careful deliberation. Seraphine, dusting the mantelpiece, looked down at her. Their eyes met. Marin held up the book, showing her a page. It was an illustration of a garden, bright with flowers. "That is beautiful," Seraphine said softly. Marin pointed to a flower in the illustration. Then she pointed to the window, beyond which the grounds of Ashworth Hall stretched in their autumn brown. "You want to know if those grow here?" The smallest nod. "They do," Seraphine said. "Not now, in winter. But in spring, if someone were to plant them." Marin looked at her. The dark eyes held a question that her mouth could not form. Then the child did something extraordinary. She reached up and placed her hand, very gently, on Seraphine's hand where it rested on the mantelpiece. The touch lasted only a moment. Then Marin withdrew, returned to her book, and continued turning pages as though nothing had happened. But something had happened, and the Duke, passing the morning room door on his way to the stables, had seen it. He stood in the corridor, out of sight, his hand on the doorframe, his chest tight with an emotion he had spent 2 years refusing to feel. Hope. In the days that followed, a new pattern emerged. The Duke began to leave books on the side table in the morning room, not randomly and not casually. They were volumes on botany, on plant illustration, on the natural history of the northern counties. He never mentioned them. He never acknowledged leaving them. They simply appeared as though the house itself were offering them. Seraphine noticed immediately. She noticed because the books were not chosen by a casual hand. They were specific, informed, precisely the kind of volumes her father would have sought out. Someone had been studying the conservatory's catalog, understanding its scope and its gaps, and selecting references to match. It was the act of a mind that paid attention to details most people would never see. She read them in the evenings, in the brief hours between the end of her duties and the fall of sleep, and when she returned each volume to the table the next morning, she would find a fresh one in its place. It became a conversation conducted entirely in silence, a dialogue of titles and subjects that said more than any words they might have exchanged. Once, she left a small sprig of dried lavender tucked between the pages of a returned book. Thank you." A gesture so subtle it might have been accidental. The next morning, the new book on the table was open to a page describing the cultivation of lavender in northern climates, and in the margin, in a hand she now recognized as the Duke's, someone had penciled a single word: "Hardy." She smiled when she read it. It was the first time she had smiled in Ashworth Hall, and it surprised her so much she had to sit down. The Duke, for his part, found himself structuring his days around her presence. He took his coffee in the library, at the hour he knew she would be dusting the upper shelves. He walked the grounds at the time she was most likely to be airing linens in the courtyard. He did not speak to her beyond the brief formal exchanges their respective positions required, but he watched her. He watched the way she handled the old books with the reverence of someone who understood their value. He watched the way she knelt to Marin's level whenever the child appeared, never looming, never condescending, meeting the girl in her own world with a patience that seemed infinite. He watched her hands, always moving, always competent, always gentle. He was not falling in love. He was too disciplined, too armored, too scarred, both inside and out, for anything as reckless as that. What was happening was slower and more dangerous. He was beginning to need her presence in the same way the house needed its walls, not as an ornament, but as a structure, something load-bearing, something without which everything else might quietly collapse. It frightened him, and he did nothing to stop it. Lady Audeley Ashworth arrived at Ashworth Hall on a Wednesday, in a carriage laden with trunks and opinions. She was the Duke's paternal aunt, a childless widow of 63, with a mind like a surgeon's knife and a tongue to match. She had silver hair piled high, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and a constitutional inability to leave well enough alone. She had come, she announced at dinner that evening, because she had heard disturbing reports. The household was in disarray. The Duke was more reclusive than ever. The child was being raised by ghosts. And there was some business involving a servant girl that sounded, in her words, thoroughly interesting. The Duke endured her presence with his customary stoicism, Lady Audley was the only person alive who could speak to him without deference, and she wielded that privilege like a weapon. She found Seraphine the next morning. The encounter appeared accidental, a chance meeting in the upstairs corridor, but Seraphine, who had survived 2 years of deception, recognized a staged event when she saw one. "You must be the famous Nell," Lady Audley said, blocking the corridor with the casual authority of a woman who had never been asked to step aside for anyone. "The one my nephew has taken such an extraordinary interest in." "His Grace has been fair to me, my lady," Seraphine said, the words careful rehearsed. "Fair," Lady Audley repeated, tasting the word as though it were a suspect vintage. "Caspian is many things. He is brilliant, he is stubborn, and he has the emotional range of a granite cliff. But fair implies a detachment I do not think he possesses in your case. He overruled his housekeeper for you. He has never overruled that woman for anyone. Why do you suppose that is? I could not say, my lady." Lady Audley studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Her blue eyes moved from Seraphine's face to her hands, reddened and roughened from months of work that was clearly beneath her. "You have a botanist's hands," she said quietly. "The fingers, the way you hold things, from the base, supporting the weight. I have seen it before. My late husband's gardener held his tools the same way, but your posture is not a gardener's posture. Your spine is too straight, your diction too clean. You are performing a role, my dear, and you are performing it well, but not well enough to fool an old woman who has spent her life watching people lie." Seraphine said nothing. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I am not your enemy," Lady Audley said, her voice softening. "I have watched Marin with you. That child has not willingly touched another human being in 2 years. She touches you. She seeks you out. She trusts you. Children, especially damaged children, do not trust liars. They trust the real thing." She reached out and took Seraphine's hand, turning it over, examining the calluses. "When you are ready to tell the truth, I will be here to listen. And so I suspect will my nephew, though he will need considerably more help arriving at the conversation." She released Seraphine's hand, smiled, and continued down the corridor, leaving behind the scent of lavender and the wreckage of Seraphine's composure. The letter from London arrived 9 days later. The Duke broke the seal in his study, alone, the door locked. He read the investigator's report twice, the second time so slowly that each word burned itself into his memory. There was no record of a Nell Graves matching the description. But the investigator had widened his search. He had found the story of a Miss Seraphine Calloway, only daughter of the late Percival Calloway, a naturalist and botanical illustrator of considerable renown. Miss Calloway had been left destitute following her father's death 3 years prior. A contested will, a relative by marriage named Horace Varnum, a solicitor since disbarred for malpractice in unrelated cases, the original will, the deed to a property called Briar Hollow in Cornwall, and a substantial collection of illustrated manuscripts had all been claimed by Varnum. Miss Calloway had vanished. The report included a physical description: dark auburn hair, gray-green eyes, slender build, quiet manner, educated to an exceptional standard in botany, Latin, and natural history. The Duke set the letter on his desk and pressed his hands flat against the wood to stop them shaking. Varnum. The name rang through his mind like a bell in an empty church. Mrs. Varnum, his housekeeper of 18 years, Horace Varnum's sister. The girl had come into this house, into the stronghold of the woman whose brother had destroyed her, and had placed herself under that woman's authority. She had scrubbed floors and sorted linens and endured the petty cruelties of a woman who was, however unknowingly, complicit in her ruin. She had done it because she believed her father had hidden the proof of her inheritance here, in the conservatory, among the very specimens he had spent years cataloging the portfolio. Her hand on the drawer labeled Centauria. She had been reaching for her own life, a rage unlike anything the Duke had ever known, settled into his chest. It was not the hot, explosive anger of youth. It was something colder, harder, more refined. It was the rage of a man who prided himself on justice and had just discovered that injustice had been thriving under his own roof, nourished by his own indifference. He stood. He crossed the house. He unlocked the conservatory. He found the drawer she had been reaching for. He found the false back panel. He found the leather portfolio and drew it out. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a will, handwritten in Percival Calloway's unmistakable hand, leaving all assets, including Briar Hollow and the complete illustrated manuscript collection, to his beloved daughter, Seraphine Helen Calloway. The second was the deed to Briar Hollow, clear and unambiguous. The third was a letter, addressed to the old Duke, Caspian's uncle. My dear Lord Thornfelt. The letter began. I write to you in confidence. My health has been uncertain of late, and I have grown uneasy about the intentions of a man named Horace Varnum, a relative of my late wife, who has begun to take an unwelcome interest in my affairs. I am enclosing the original will and deed for safekeeping among my work in your conservatory, where I trust they will remain undisturbed. Should anything befall me, I ask that you ensure these documents reach my daughter. She is my life's work, more than any painting or catalog. Everything I have is hers. The letter was signed, with gratitude and enduring respect, Percival Calloway. The old Duke had died 6 months before Percival. The letter had never been read, the documents had never been found, and Seraphine Calloway had been left to the mercy of a thief with a forged will and a sister in a position of absolute domestic power. The Duke stood in the conservatory, the letter in his hand, the moonlight pooling on the glass above him, and felt the full weight of his family's failure. The old Duke had been trusted with a father's last hope, and that trust had been buried and forgotten. And he, Caspian, had compounded the failure with 2 years of blind indifference, approving the housekeeper's cruelties, ignoring the signs, retreating into his scar and his grief and his ledgers, while a woman was being ground to dust beneath his feet. He knew what he must do, and he knew that doing it would destroy the household as he knew it. He placed the documents in the inside pocket of his coat, locked the conservatory, and returned to his study. He sat at his desk. He rang the bell. "Send word to Mrs. Varnum and to Miss Graves," he told the footman, his voice quiet and even and terrible. "They are to come to the library in 1 hour, both of them, together." The hour that followed was the longest of Seraphine's life. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands folded, her breath shallow, and tried to prepare herself for every possible outcome. Dismissal, arrest, exposure. She had been discovered in the conservatory. The Duke knew something. The question was how much. She descended to the library, with legs that felt made of lead. The great house was hushed, the corridors empty. The library door stood open, warm light spilling from within. Mrs. Varnum was already there, standing before the Duke's desk with her back straight and her chin high. She wore the expression she always wore in formal situations, one of unassailable competence. She did not look at Seraphine as she entered. The Duke stood behind his desk. He was in his dark coat, buttoned to the throat, his scarred face lit by the lamps. The portfolio lay on the desk before him. Beside it, the letter. Seraphine saw them, and her world tilted. The leather portfolio. She would have known it anywhere. Her father had carried it everywhere, the soft brown leather, worn to the texture of cloth by years of handling. It was here, on the desk, open. He had found it. "Close the door," the Duke said. Seraphine obeyed. She stood beside Mrs. Varnum, a few feet of charged air between them. The 2 women, one who had everything to lose and one who had already lost everything, faced the man who held the balance. "Varnum," the Duke began, his voice low and controlled, "you have served this house for 18 years. You have been its backbone, its keeper of standards, its guardian of order. I have trusted you absolutely." He paused. That trust is ended. The housekeeper's face did not change, but her hands clasped at her waist tightened until the knuckles whitened. You told me that this young woman was a disruption, that she was sly, manipulative, a threat to the household. You restricted her movements, you banished her to the cellars, you attempted to have her dismissed on fabricated charges. And when I asked you why, you spoke of propriety and good order. His voice dropped. You never once mentioned your brother. The color drained from Mrs. Varnum's face. It did not fade gradually. It vanished as though someone had pulled a stopper and let her blood run out. Her mouth opened, no sound emerged. Your brother, the Duke continued, each word precise and merciless. Horace Varnum, who forged a dead man's will and stole his daughter's inheritance, who took a scholar's life work and sold it for profit, who cast a young woman out of her own home with nothing. He picked up the letter from the desk, a letter from that scholar to my uncle, entrusting these documents to his care. A letter that was never read because my uncle died before it reached him. A letter that has sat in my conservatory for 3 years while you, Mrs. Varnum, helped your brother profit from its absence. I did not know. The words burst from the housekeeper, strangled and desperate. I swear to you, Your Grace, I did not know about any documents. My brother told me the father was a spendthrift, that the girl had no claim, that the will was legitimate. And when that girl appeared in your household, the Duke said, his voice cutting through her protests like a blade through silk, when she came here seeking the proof your brother had failed to destroy, what did you do? You did not recognize her, perhaps, but you sensed something. You sensed that she was a threat, not to the household but to your family's lie. And you tried to crush her. He turned to Seraphine. His face, both the scarred side and the whole, was alight with an emotion she had never seen directed at her, a fierce, protective, almost anguished tenderness. Is that not so? He said, his voice rough. Miss Calloway, her name, her real name, spoken in this room, in this house, by this man. It hit her like a wave, a force so vast it took her breath and her balance and her carefully maintained composure all at once. She felt her knees buckle. She caught herself on the back of a chair, her fingers white against the leather. Tears came. She had held them for 3 years. Through the funeral and the solicitor's office, and the cold, empty rooms and the forged will and the months of scrubbing and silence and fear. She had held them through all of it, and now they came, not in sobs, but in a silent, steady flood that streamed down her face and fell onto her chapped, reddened scholar's hands. She could not speak. She could only nod. Mrs. Varnum made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a structure collapsing, the grinding, awful noise of something massive and rigid finally breaking apart. She looked from the Duke to Seraphine, and for the first time she truly saw the woman she had been persecuting. Not a sly servant, not a schemer, a daughter, a woman her own brother had destroyed. What will become of me? The housekeeper whispered. The Duke looked at Seraphine. He saw the tears, the shaking hands, the dignity that persisted even in the wreckage of her composure. He saw a woman who had endured every cruelty this house could inflict, and had never once sought revenge, only justice. You will leave Ashworth Hall, he said, turning back to Mrs. Varnum. A cottage will be found for you on one of the outlying farms. You will have a roof and a small allowance. It is more mercy than your brother showed, Miss Calloway, and it is more than you have earned. But it is what she would want, and it is therefore what I will give. He did not need to look at Seraphine to know this was true. He had watched her long enough to understand the architecture of her character. She did not want vengeance. She wanted her name back. Mrs. Varnum stood for a moment, swaying slightly, her world reduced to rubble around her. Then she gave a small, broken nod and walked out of the library. She did not look back. She did not close the door. She simply walked into the darkness of the corridor, and the sound of her footsteps faded like the last notes of a song no one would sing again. The Duke and Seraphine were alone. The library was very quiet. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. The documents lay on the desk between them, the parchment glowing in the lamplight. "These are yours," the Duke said. His voice was hoarse. He pushed the portfolio towards her. "They were always yours." Seraphine stepped forward. She laid her hand on the portfolio, on the leather her father had touched 1,000 times. She opened it. She saw his handwriting, the clean, familiar loops of her name. Seraphine Helen Calloway. She pressed the paper to her chest and held it there, her eyes closed, her body curved around it like a shelter around a flame. "Thank you," she whispered. "It is I who must ask forgiveness," he said. He came around the desk and stood before her. He was very tall, and in the lamplight his scar was a map of everything he had survived. "You came into this house seeking justice, and you found only cruelty. My family failed your father. I failed you. I saw you every day, and I did not see you." She opened her eyes. She looked at him, at the ruin and the beauty and the raw, unguarded pain in his face. And she said something that surprised them both. The words hung in the air between them, charged with a meaning that neither was ready to fully acknowledge. The Duke held her gaze. His hand rose, almost involuntarily, and then stopped. He let it fall. "Welcome to Ashworth Hall," he said quietly. "Miss Calloway." Mrs. Varnum left Ashworth Hall at dawn the following morning, carrying a single trunk and the silence of a household that had nothing left to say to her. No one watched her go. No one needed to. The era she had represented, rigid, cold, and built on a foundation of lies, was over. Seraphine did not watch either. She was sitting on the edge of her narrow bed in the servants' wing, her father's portfolio open on her lap, reading his letter to the old Duke for the 3rd time. "She is my life's work, more than any painting or catalogue. Everything I have is hers." The tears came quietly, a slow release after 3 years of holding. The Duke moved quickly. By the end of the week, Seraphine had been installed in a suite of rooms in the South Wing, appointed as the salaried curator of the Ashworth Hall Conservatory and Natural History Collection, and given complete autonomy over her father's legacy. It was not charity. It was a position designed with the same meticulous precision the Duke brought to everything, one that gave her purpose, independence, and a home without the faintest shadow of obligation. "You have thought about this," she had said when he laid out the terms. "I have thought about little else," he had replied, and the air between them had held still for a moment before they both looked away. The conservatory came back to life under her hands. She directed the glaziers, who replaced the fire-damaged panels. She supervised the replanting, selecting specimens from nurseries in Edinburgh and London to fill the gaps the neglect had left. The head gardener, a weathered man named Tully who had worked the estate for 30 years, regarded her with suspicion for exactly one conversation, during which she identified the soil's pH imbalance, diagnosed the drainage failure, and quoted her father's original planting notes from memory. After that, he was her most devoted ally. The Camellia japonica, its trunk scarred where a falling beam had grazed it, produced its first blooms in February. The Helleborus colonized the corner bed. And the cornflowers, her father's flower, the cipher that had led her to the hidden drawer, grew in a terracotta pot on the central bench, blue as a summer sky. Horace Varnum came, inevitably. He arrived in a cheap hired carriage on a gray morning, blustering about forged documents and fraudulent claims. The Duke received him in the morning room with a folder he had prepared weeks in advance, containing a statement from the Law Society confirming the solicitor's disbarment, a sworn affidavit from Dr. Hadley, and a handwriting expert's analysis proving the forged will was exactly that. He gave Horace one opportunity to leave. Horace took it. He did not return. In the doorway, Seraphine watched him go, the man who had stolen her life, and spoke to him directly for the only time. "My father trusted a duke with his daughter's future," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "He was right to do so." The Duke, standing behind her, pressed his scarred hand against his chest, and said nothing. He did not need to. The expression on his face, raw and unguarded and fierce, said everything. The months that followed were the first in Seraphine's life that she would later describe as quiet. Not empty, not idle, but quiet in the way that growing things are quiet. The constant, invisible work of roots finding their depth. She painted. She rose early each morning and walked to the conservatory, where she continued her father's catalogue, illustrating the specimens as they were now, scarred by fire and neglect, but alive. The Duke brought his estate papers and worked at the opposite end of the bench each afternoon. They spoke little. They did not need to. The silence between them was a living thing, warm and full, and what it contained grew deeper with each passing day. The books he left on her desk, the lavender she pressed between returned pages, the word he had penciled in a margin months ago. All of it was a conversation that neither had the courage to finish. They were falling in love the way plants grow. Slowly, steadily, in a direction neither could control. Marin was the measure of the change. The child had returned to Seraphine's side the day after the reckoning, slipping into the conservatory with her rag doll and her picture book, and she had not left since she came. Every morning, she sat on a stool by the workbench and watched Seraphine paint, her dark eyes absorbing every brushstroke. She drew pictures of flowers and trees, and increasingly, of three figures standing together, a tall man, a woman with reddish hair, and a very small girl between them. She left these drawings where both adults would find them. Neither, commented the Duke, kept every one in the top drawer of his desk. Will sa. Lady Audley, who had extended her visit indefinitely, watched it all with the impatience of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize love and was thoroughly exasperated by its refusal to announce itself. "You are both idiots," she informed her nephew at dinner one evening. "She loves you, and you love her, and the only two people who have not acknowledged it are the two people most affected by it." "She has endured too much," the Duke said. "I will not burden her with declarations she is not ready to hear. Caspian, you survived a fire. You carried a child from a burning building, but you cannot tell a woman that you love her." He did not answer. But that night alone in his study, he acknowledged what he had been resisting for months. He loved her. He had loved her since the night she told him the Helleborus was alive, and the feeling was not going away. Marin spoke on a Tuesday in late February. Seraphine was repotting a cutting of the old Daphne odora, its first buds swelling with the promise of bloom. The child was beside her, holding the pot steady, watching the careful work of Seraphine's hands. The scent of the plant, sweet and impossibly alive for midwinter, filled the glass house. And then, as naturally as a flower opening, Marin said, "Seraphine, is that one going to live?" The words were quiet, slightly hoarse from 2.5 years of disuse, but they were clear and real. They were a question asked by a child who had decided the world contained at least one person worth talking to. Seraphine's hands went still. She looked at the small, serious face, at the eyes that held not fear, but a fragile, luminous hope, and felt something crack open inside her that she had not known was closed. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Yes, darling. It is going to live." The Duke heard about it within the hour. He walked to the conservatory, opened the door, and found them together. Marin looked up, saw him, and spoke her second word. "Uncle." He knelt on the stone floor, heedless of his clothes, and opened his arms. Marin stepped forward and wrapped her thin arms around his neck. He held her, the scar pressed against her hair, the tears running freely down his face, and the only sound was the breathing of 3 people who had each, in their own way, come through the fire and survived. When he raised his head, his eyes found Seraphine's. He did not hide the tears. He let her see him, undefended, unarmored. "Thank you," he said. "She was always going to find her way back," Seraphine said softly. She just needed someone to wait. Spring came to Ashworth Hall. The conservatory blazed with color. The legal settlement was finalized. Briar Hollow returned to Seraphine's name. She was a woman of independent means, free to leave. She did not leave. On an evening in late June, with the longest day's light lingering gold across the lake, the Duke asked her to walk with him. They followed the path through the parkland in silence, the water a mirror of amber before them. "You owe me nothing, Seraphine," he said, stopping by the shore. "You are free. No one has the right to ask you to stay." He paused. The breath he drew was not steady. "But I am going to ask anyway." He took her hands. "I am a methodical man. I do not rush. But I have learned from you that the right moment is the one where you stop calculating and simply walk across the floor." His dark eyes held hers, the scarred side of his face turned toward the setting sun. "I love you. I have loved you in silence, in margins, in book cards and botanical Latin, and every inadequate gesture of a man who does not know how to say what he means. I am asking you, Seraphine Calloway, to stay, not as my curator, as my wife." She looked at his face, at the scar that had made a room full of people step backward, at the man who had stood alone and never asked for help, and she placed her hand against the scarred side of his face. "I crossed that ballroom because I recognized you," she said, her voice steady and sure. "The loneliness, the pride, the refusal to break. I recognized all of it because it was mine too." She smiled, and the smile was luminous. "Yes, I will stay." He covered her hand with his and held it against his scar, against the evidence of everything he had lost and found. Then he kissed her, a quiet, deliberate, certain act. And the world did not explode into fireworks. It simply settled, like a building finding its foundations. In the conservatory, the Daphne odora bloomed in the fading light. Merit, on Seraphine's workbench, her latest illustration showed the flower in full detail, every petal precise, the scar on its trunk painted with the same loving attention as the blossoms. Because the painter understood, as only someone who has been scarred and survived can understand, that damage and beauty are not opposites. They are the same story, told from different angles. And in the wicker chair by the door, Marin sat with her picture book, watching the two figures by the lake through the glass, and smiled, the careful, knowing smile of a child who understood that some broken things can be made whole again, not by forgetting the damage, but by choosing, with patience and courage, to grow through it. The grounds of Ashworth Hall stretched green and gold to the horizon. The conservatory gleamed, and somewhere in the parkland, a single bird began to sing.